Today I'm going to talk about adrenal gland. Adrenal glands are small triangular shaped glands located on the top of the kidneys. It is also known as suprarenal gland. Adrenal glands are composed of two parts, the cortex and a medulla. Adrenal cortex is the outer region and also the largest part of the gland. It is divided into three separate zones. Number 1, zona glomerulosa. Number 2, zona fasciculata. Number 3, zona reticularis. Right? Okay. Now, the zona glomerulosa secretes mineralocorticoids. Zona fasciculata secrete glucocorticoids, and zona reticularis secrete androgen. Now, mineralocorticoids also we known as aldosterone, and the glucocorticoids we also known as the cortisol. All hormones of the adrenal cortex are derived from cholesterol. Adrenal medulla is located in the center of the gland and it produces adrenaline and noradrenaline. Adrenal medulla is an extension of the sympathetic nervous system that secretes catecholamines into the capillaries rather than synapse. Now talk about the cortisol. More than 95% of circulating cortisol is bound to protein that is called cortisol binding globulin, which is increased by estrogen. The relation between the cortisol and aldosterone. Cortisol can activate mineralocorticoid, that is aldosterone receptors, but normally it doesn't do so because mineralocorticoid receptor express an enzyme that is called 11-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase type 2, which inactivates cortisol. But inhibitors of beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase type 2 such as licorice and also the mutation in the gene which causes cortisol to act as a mineralocorticoid that leads to or resulting in sodium retention and also that causes hypertension, HTN. Now talk about the classification of disease of adrenal glands. We need to remember at least 4 things. Number 1 is hormone excess, hormone deficiency, hormone hypersensitivity, and hormone resistance. Okay, so hormone excess again we divide into 2. One is primary, one is secondary. Now primary cause is non-ACTH dependent, but the secondary is ACTH dependent. Other than that, we have Cushing syndrome, primary hyperaldosteronism, and pheochromocytoma, and secondary we have Cushing syndrome and secondary hyperaldosteronism. Now hormone deficiency we have Addison's disease and congenital adrenal hyperplasia. Hormone sensitivity we have 11-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase type 2 deficiency and Liddle syndrome. And we have hormone resistance and non-functioning tumors. Now in terms into control of adrenocortical hormones is especially cortisol, it is controlled by hypothalamus. From hypothalamus it secretes corticotropin releasing hormone, then it triggers the pituitary gland, means anterior pituitary, then they secrete ACTH, means adrenocorticotropic hormone, then it goes to adrenal cortex to secrete glucocorticoids. When it is done, means when it is over, then it gives the negative signal to the pituitary and hypothalamus to stop the secretions. Now if we look about the synthesis of aldosterone hormone, firstly we need to think about the steps and also enzymes. First we see the enzymes, then we will talk about the steps. Okay, the enzymes are needed for aldosterone hormone synthesis are cholesterol desmolase, number 2 3 beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase, number 3 21 hydroxylase, number 4 11 beta hydroxylase, and number 5 is aldosterone synthase. Now first I'll talk about the mnemonics, that how you can remember step by step, right? So the mnemonics are CPPCCA, right? C for cholesterol, P for pregnenolone, P for progesterone, C for corticosterone. But we need to understand about 11-deoxycorticosterone, but we need to focus on C because it is easy to remember. C for corticosterone, before that one you need to put 11-deoxy. So C for 11-deoxycorticosterone, and the next is C for corticosterone and A for aldosterone. So here you can see now we put enzymes within the steps, okay? Firstly, from cholesterol to pregnenolone is done by cholesterol desmolase. From pregnenolone to progesterone is done by 3 beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase. Next, from progesterone to 11-deoxycorticosterone is done by 21 hydroxylase, and from 11-deoxycorticosterone to corticosterone is done by 11 beta hydroxylase, and from corticosterone to aldosterone is done by aldosterone synthase. So this is the steps, and these are the enzymes we need to from cholesterol to aldosterone. Now I want to talk about some enzyme deficiencies. If we have enzyme deficiency of 21 hydroxylase, that leads to sodium loss. If the sodium loss, we call it salt losing form of congenital virilizing adrenal hyperplasia. And if the deficiency of 11 beta hydroxylase, that leads to sodium and water retention, and that leads to hypertensive form of congenital virilizing adrenal hyperplasia. Now talk about some effects, means effects of mineralocorticoids or aldosterone. In the kidney, it acts on primarily on the principal cells, we call it P cells. That leads to reabsorption of sodium in exchange of potassium and hydrogen. That leads to increased urine acidity. Number 2, it increases the reabsorption of sodium from the urine, sweat, saliva and colon. Number 3, it increases tubular hydrogen secretion. Now the effects of adrenalectomy, means if we remove adrenal gland from the body, then that leads to hyponatremia, hyperkalemia and hypertension and shock. Now I want to talk about some structure and function of the adrenal glands. If we see in the figure, if we talk about hypothalamo-pituitary axis, that leads to ACTH secretion, then it goes to adrenal cortex and stimulates zona fasciculata and reticularis. That leads to secrete androgen and also cortisol. That cortisol stimulates glucocorticoid receptor stimulation. That leads to protein catabolism and hypertension, also insulin resistance. Now think about sympathetic nervous system. If the sympathetic nervous system stimulates, then it goes to adrenal medulla and secretes adrenaline and noradrenaline. Now this adrenaline, it stimulates the beta receptor, but noradrenaline, it stimulates alpha receptor. Beta receptor, it causes vasodilatation, tachycardia, and insulin resistance. But alpha receptor, it causes vasoconstrictions. Now, if we see the below adrenal cortex zona glomerulosa, zona glomerulosa stimulates aldosterone secretion and it acts on the kidneys especially. Now, if we think about the kidneys, if low renal perfusion, low filtrated sodium, and sympathetic stimulation, that leads to increased renin secretion, and in turns into renin secretion, it goes to renin angiotensin aldosterone axis. After secretion of renin into the circulation, angiotensinogen is converted to angiotensin 1 by the help of renin. Then angiotensin 1 converted to angiotensin 2 by the help of angiotensin converting enzyme. Now, this angiotensin 2 goes to adrenal cortex and stimulates zona glomerulosa to secrete aldosterone. And in the kidneys, they act on the renal tubules that leads to sodium reabsorption and potassium excretion. This is how renin angiotensin aldosterone axis is working. Now I want to talk about the major actions between cortisol and aldosterone. Okay, so we talk about the liver, we talk about cardiovascular system, we talk about the kidneys and immune system. Okay, so the glucocorticoids, it leads to protein catabolism and gluconeogenesis that leads to increased blood glucose. But in terms of mineralocorticoids, no such things are happening. Now comes into aldosterone, it only acts on the kidneys, and in the kidney it causes sodium reabsorption and potassium and hydrogen excretion. That's all for today. Thanks for joining with us and have a great day.